Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to LIBOR's Wednesday webinar. My name is Marianne Monteleone, Vice President of Professional Development for LIBOR. As I mentioned 2 Wednesdays ago, April is National Fair Housing Month, and LIBOR has dedicated each Wednesday to fair housing initiatives and different aspects of. And today we have Tanya Luda with us, who will speak about implicit bias, both conscious and unconscious. I would like to formally introduce Tanya and then turn it over to her. Tanya Luda Gordon is the owner, CEO, and president of La Vie Development, a New York State certified company founded by Tanya in 2006, which provides versatile, innovative, and high-quality professional services in the area of leadership training. Her company's success stems from Tanya's 35 years of experience, which is translated into her ability to quickly and effectively understand the client's unique needs. Tanya is also the executive director of New Millennium Development Services, Inc., for over 17 years, a community-based organization whose primary mission is the revitalization of communities through economic development. She is a graduate of Spelman College with a degree in English and political science. Her subject today, which is an area she has studied extensively, is understanding implicit bias, both conscious and unconscious. So happy to have you back with us today. Welcome, Tanya. I turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Marianne, thank you so much for that introduction and the invitation to speak to the LIBOR members today about a very important topic, implicit and unconscious bias, and how it impacts our decisions. Certainly, I am so excited about the opportunity to again present to the LIBOR membership. So without further ado, let's get started and let's really tackle this subject matter of implicit and unconscious bias and how it impacts all of our lives. First, let's look at the definition of implicit bias. Implicit refers to bias that is implicit but not said directly. 5 common characteristics of implicit biases are: first, implicit biases are pervasive. Everyone possesses them, even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, such as judges. But this is the key. We are all human beings that are byproducts of our life experiences. And so bias is very real in all of our lives, and it can be implicit, it can be unconscious. But again, even those of us who pride ourselves and work diligently on being mindful of biases and it not impacting our decisions, we still are affected by that. And that is the reality of our lives. Now, next topic, implicit and explicit biases are related but distinct mental constructs. They are not mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other. The implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. And we're going to really delve into that subject matter because we tend to pride ourselves on being fair and just and equitable. And you're going to hear those 3 words several times throughout my presentation. That is our belief system. But sometimes the decisions we make are impacted by implicit biases that we have, which might not always duplicate or support our belief system. Next, we generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in group. Though research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases uh, against our in group. Now, this is very, very interesting because oftentimes when we look at our own in group, that's our comfort zone. We hold true similar beliefs and attitudes. We tend to be similar as far as our ethnicity, our worship experience, our neighbors. And so we tend to look favorably upon our in group. However, there are times when there might be negative biases towards our own in group. Our brains are malleable. Implicit biases are malleable. Our brains are incredibly complex. And the implicit associations that we have formed can be gradually unlearned through a variety of de-biasing techniques. Now, when we look at the definition of unconscious bias, it is a term that describes the associations we hold outside our conscious awareness and control. 5 of the most common characteristics of unconscious bias are: first, affinity bias. Affinity bias leads us to favor people who we feel we have a connection or a similarity. You heard me previously refer to an in group. So, what are the characteristics that make us feel that we belong to this in group? And again, it can be based on, like I said, ethnicity, our belief system, our attitudes, our ideas, our neighbors, our family, and friends. We tend to have a bias. And the bias tends to be favorable, right? Because most of us look at ourselves from a standpoint of good. And so it's going to be a positive bias oftentimes when we're talking about affinity bias. Halo effect happens when you judge a person's qualities by other unrelated, usually physical qualities. For example, a sharply dressed coworker might be judged to be more competent than a coworker wearing a t-shirt. You're going to hear me constantly say that biases tend to be based on perceptions, but not always reality. You know the saying, dress for success. And oftentimes, persons that are in a decision making capacity, if they see a coworker that dressed for the position that they uh, look forward to achieving with your firm, then oftentimes you will see that person in that capacity, as opposed to someone who is more casual dressed, might have more capabilities in that space, but because of the perception of how they dress, they are judged accordingly. Now let's talk about the horns effect, which focuses on one particularly negative feature about a person, which clouds your view of their other qualities. For example, if a person uses a particular term or phrase you dislike, you may suddenly dislike everything else they have to say. Attribution bias. This occurs when we incorrectly evaluate the reasons behind the experience and accomplishments of others. Usually, this means we believe individual successes are due to lack as opposed to effort or skill, which is seen to be behind their negative experiences of others. And then finally, confirmation bias refers to the tendency to look for or favor information that confirms beliefs we already hold. So now let's delve into section 1. What is implicit bias? So the first lesson that we will be talking about, we want to really discuss the foundational understanding of what implicit bias is and why it even matters to any of us as we pursue diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice in how we treat people, both in our personal and our professional life. So during this section, we are going to talk about implicit bias, but we're also looking at the attitudes or stereotypes that affect the actions that we have day to day, decisions that we make. And all of this deals with how we treat other people because of this bias. So we're going to start to unpack this a little bit. So now the word bias. For some time now, bias tends to have a negative connotation. However, bias in and of itself is really a neutral term. But because of how it has been utilized in our society, one tends to think favorable or unfavorable, right? Negative or positive. But the takeaway that I really want you to understand at this point is that bias in and of itself doesn't have to fall into either of those categories. It can be absolutely, totally neutral. And we will deal with this more. So now let's talk about an example I have here. We have 3 colored balls. A red ball that I tend to be favorable towards, a blue ball that I'm not favorable towards, and yellow, I'm neutral towards that. Now, this in and of itself is a very harmless, simple example of bias. But what I want you to do is to translate this into how we see other people, how we treat people. As I said, red, the ball in and of itself, has no major bearing on myself or who I deal with. But if we look at red and we translate that in how we perceive people and we interact and engage with them, then this is favorable, right? People that might be part of your family, your friends, people you went to school with, people that you worship with, whatever you have in common with these people. For this exercise and today's webinar, let's look at it from a positive standpoint, just to reinforce the lesson that I am trying to teach you today. Blue deals with what is not favorable for you. Well, you might have a preconceived notion about a particular group of people based on their ethnicity, based on how they worship, what their worldview is. And so when we begin to do that, let's keep in mind the blue ball for this exercise. And then, of course, yellow is neutral. Neither positive or really negative. It doesn't matter to us. And there are people that we deal with that fall into that category also. So when we say that our physiological processes are implicit or unconscious, we are simply referring to something operating outside of our conscious awareness, like bias. The term implicit in and of itself isn't a good or bad thing. In fact, as you will learn later in this training, we rely on implicit processes to move efficiently throughout the world. And we're going to talk more about how that happens. So, by definition, the takeaway here is that bias is really nothing more than our evaluation our beliefs. Um, Sometimes it can be positive, sometimes it can be negative, but it can exist without us even realizing it. And sometimes when it is a bias that we are not really aware of, sometimes that can have just as much impact on our decision making as a bias that we are aware of. So it is very true that we can have biases that are hidden to ourselves, that they aren't necessarily bad. And then you might ask yourself, well, then why are we talking about that? Because it has a major impact on how we interact with people and the decisions that we make as we engage with people. So let's look at this subject matter about bias. There are times when we make decisions about people that it is not based on due diligence, us really getting to know them, or even more so, facts. It can be based on emotionalism, past experiences. And sometimes, because of these inaccurate belief systems, it causes us to have stereotypes. And there are people that might not be consistent with what our stereotypical belief system is, but because of challenges we have with biases, it can impact how we perceive them, how we treat them, which oftentimes might not be fair and just. So it is very important that we understand why is this an important topic? Because it has a major impact on our perceptions, our attitudes, our behaviors, and our decisions. Oftentimes, implicit bias might undermine our ability to really live up to our value system of equity and fairness. And because implicit bias can be based on attitudes that we've developed, and we're going to deal with some of these that impact us, but because this forces us to sometimes not be fair and equitable to other persons, we have to deal with this head on, to be able to be aware of how implicit bias can impact us and how it can create real world barriers to us being fair to other people. And I'm looking forward to getting more into that subject matter so we can really find out what makes us tick, right? What makes us feel the way we do, and how do we deal effectively with these challenges? So these practical applications are why it is so important to learn about implicit bias, particularly those biases that are not aligned with our belief system, because there are times that any of us, because as I said in the beginning, we all have biases. We are all byproducts of our life experiences. But once we're able to fully understand implicit bias and how it impacts our lives and even those that we interact with, we will then be able to understand how the decisions we make are more consistent with our explicit belief system in being fair and just with other people. So to summarize, implicit bias refers to attitudes or stereotypes we hold outside of our conscious behavior. Implicit bias does not refer to those beliefs we are aware of, but that we conceal or suppress in an effort to appear non-biased. And again, we all deal with this because we all come with our own individual belief systems and would like to believe that we live our life that way and we make decisions accordingly. But there are times in all of our lives where implicit bias can undermine what our belief system is in being fair and just. Again, we're going to go back and look at this example that I discussed earlier in the presentation. And when we look at the word attitude, it describes your evaluation of some concept, like a person, an idea, a thought process. And so with red, we look at it from a favorable standpoint. Again, this is a red ball, but I want you to translate that into being positive towards, let's say, your in group or even other people. Bias, we know, and we've already discussed, it can be based on emotionalism as opposed to actual facts. And so that is why the takeaway here is this is a simple exercise with a ball, but it can be translated to how we engage with people from a positive standpoint. Blue is negative. And again, we can utilize this example the same way. There might be people that are not part of our inner group. They're not those that we engage with from a point of perspective of our comfort zone. And we might regard them in an unfavorable sense, but that is because of, again, it could be an episode that happened in your life. It could be part of upbringing. It can be a myriad of reasons why you feel negative towards people that fall into another group. So when we talk about blue ball, I need you to translate it to further understand the exercise and what I'm hoping to accomplish with you, understanding biases from both a positive and a negative standpoint. So now we use the word stereotype to refer to those beliefs that are mentally associated with a given category. So let's give you an example. Asian people are oftentimes regarded as good in math. Men are oftentimes associated with being in the workplace more often than women are. Now, although it is certainly a positive trait to be good in math, but this is where it might not best serve you into making a decision based on this, where you have no facts, but it's an assumption on your part because of a perception or what you have believed. But when you are in a position where you're interacting with a person that is Asian, who might not be a strong suit when it comes to math, it does not serve them well or even you in just assuming that they're good in math. So give you an example. If you're looking to hire someone, they might be more gifted in another space. But because you might think, oh, automatically they're good in math, you might be thinking for them to fulfill a certain position. That is not going to really be in their best interest or even yours. Now, let's talk about the workplace. I use an example that I had the opportunity to go to a major event about a month ago now, and there were an overwhelming amount of men that were there as well as women. And I had to check my own biases that has been impacted by socialization through television, through movies, through books I read, which tends to make one thing that men certainly are probably one who are more in the decision-making capacity, more so leadership. And again, when I said I had to check myself, because when I looked at this audience, I realized that, I might think that women might be there in more of a supportive role, but I wasn't basing that on facts. I never surveyed the audience to find that out. I was basing that on biases through socialization, which was not accurate. So this is a great example to show you how all of us have been impacted by biases But it is the reality that oftentimes it is not based on facts. It is not based on due diligence. It is not based on getting to know people. It is based on assumptions and perceptions. And so this is very important takeaway at this point of the presentation. So you ask yourself, why is this topic even important for us to consider with so many issues that we're dealing with today that impact our lives, dealing with pursuit of equity and fairness? It is because this is just another tool that we use on how we can show our commitment to fairness and equity and how it can be disrupted through bias. And so it is very, very important that we understand and appreciate this subject matter so that we can oftentimes evaluate how we perceive a situation, how we perceive people that might not be consistent, again, as I said before, with our belief system, but the tool will help us be more mindful so that we're basing our decisions on facts, not emotionalism, not on attitudes that we've held for years that might be totally insufficient, based on insufficient data. Now, let's look at the takeaway from addressing explicit or direct instances of discrimination. It is very important that when we're considering implicit bias, that we don't take away what implicit bias is from dealing with direct and explicit instances of discrimination. Even though the path can become intertwined, there is a distinction between that of discrimination and implicit biases. So in fact, the effects of implicit and explicit and institutional biases are informed and contribute to each other. Now, let's go into section 2, unconscious bias. Unconscious bias are the biases that everyone has that live in the dark recesses of the human brain. So in this section, we're going to introduce some ideas and techniques that define unconscious bias that are very common today. We're going to look at some of the various types of unconscious biases. We also want to look at how did that originate with each and every one of that? How did that come about? And how it is ingrained in our decision-making process. And then how do we confront unconscious bias individually? So to be able to discuss this, and I'm talking about, of course, unconscious bias that everyone possesses, we first must clearly define it. Then we need to look at the causes and effects and the possible necessary changes that we need to address in each and every one of our lives so we will make our decisions based on facts as opposed to emotionalism, triggers that we're going to talk later in this presentation that can have an effect on how we engage with people. Unconscious bias is usually thought of as a social means of stereotyping and is more common than conscious bias. Unconscious bias, it is deeply rooted in the human brain. Now, as we go through our lives each and every day, we're collecting data and then we're categorizing it. And as we categorize it, and let's just look at people that we interact with. So if something happens to you on the way to work, on the way to taking your children to school, something you see in the news, You're going to collect that data, but you're going to categorize it. And when we categorize, we oftentimes will look at that category as good or bad. As I said in the earlier presentation, when we're looking at our own personal in-group, because we oftentimes look at ourselves as good, we're going to also look at those persons that we feel we have a connection with, we have a commonality with from a good standpoint. Whereas when we're looking at other groups, we might not be favorable towards them because of the biases. And so we might look at them as bad. The work culture, an organization that allows bias to influence that organization, that business, can be negative and toxic. And it can also have an impact on really people that we're working with that have really excellent skill sets with what they bring to the table. But if they feel that the lack of diversity and opportunity is in the workplace, they might soon move on to a healthier company, which can have a negative impact on our work environment. But translate this also into our personal lives. So this is how biases can have an impact on our day-to-day lives. Now let's talk about triggers. Triggers can be based on past experience. You might have had a negative past experience with a person that is in another group, right? But in this case, you now, because of that bad experience, you will then look at everyone in that group from that negative perspective, which causes us to not always be fair and just to those people just because of one past experience or multiple past experiences. The environment in which a child is raised can have a major impact on how one deals with people from a bias standpoint. And then we have the educational system. Oftentimes, I talk about the fact that when I was in third grade, my parents put me in private school. The children that I interacted with, they were not used to dealing with someone different than themselves. It made it a trying experience for them and also for me because I had to learn how to navigate in that environment as well as they did. But one of the things that I always express that is so important is how we need to always keep an open mind. We might have a negative experience, but when we close ourselves off and we assume that everyone is the same based on that experience we had, we might prevent ourselves from having a positive experience, even believe it or not, with the same people. So from third to sixth grade, I engaged with children who really had not much experience with socialization, dealing with different people, different attitudes, different worldviews. But I did have the opportunity to go back to engaging with those same children in high school. Now, all of those years had changed their mindset and their attitudes because they had an opportunity to deal with people from different backgrounds, the different religious beliefs, different points of view, which made them much more open-minded and much more inclusive by the time I engaged with them at 11th and 12th grade, which proved to be a wonderful experience for myself. So the takeaway here is triggers are very real in all of our lives and will have an impact on our biases if we don't know how to check them or to even check them. So I encourage you to always try to have an open mind, regardless of your past experience, because you might be pleasingly surprised at what a positive experience you can have when you let yourself engage with people and not bring the negative attitudes to that potential opportunity of interaction. Now, let's look at the types of unconscious bias that fall within 4 categories. Now, previously I talked about this, but I talked about it from a definition standpoint. Now I want to deal with it with examples for you, dealing with affinity, halo effect, attribution, and confirmation. Affinity bias. Affinity bias can cause a person to gravitate more towards people that share their interests, reside in their same neighborhood, or attended the same school. Halo effect. A good example of the halo effect bias is when an employer only hires graduates from specific schools. Great example. One might think that with upper management, I want Ivy League persons to consider for this position. But it is not necessarily factual that they will serve best in that position. There might be people that come from other schools but are better suited for the type of positions that you're looking to fill. And so this is a bias that can be favorable sometimes, but it can also be undermining for those who are more qualified and better suited, but because of your biases, you're not really giving them that serious consideration. Attribution bias. The attribution bias is judging another person before knowing the facts, forming an opinion before having all the information. That is the core essence of what we want to avoid when dealing with bias, because it is not based oftentimes on facts, but it will still have a major impact on your decision-making process. We always want to be thoughtful and mindful when making decisions, so we are always fair and equitable. Confirmation bias is best defined as using one's own beliefs or ideas to judge another person or a situation, instead of using the facts or proven merits. This type of bias can occur in the workplace when, let's say, a manager forms an opinion of an applicant based on that person's name instead of their true ability. And instead of giving yourself the opportunity to get to know them on a one-on-one basis, you relegate them to a category and have a negative connotation sometimes with that category, which is not really being fair towards that applicant who might be ideal for what you're looking for, but because of your bias, known and unknown, you put them at a disadvantage. Now, let's talk about the fourth and final section, and that is how to reduce bias. Now, there are times when all of us can feel that this issue of bias is so overwhelming, it's so big. How can I possibly make a difference? I'm just one person. Well, guess what? When we're looking to mitigate unwanted bias, it starts with us looking at the man in the mirror. You know, before you try to tackle the world, your neighbors, your family, your friends, start with yourself. Start to begin to evaluate your own biases, your own prejudices, which we all have. And then we can begin to effectively look at how to address the issue of bias and how we can address it when it rears up its head in our lives, and how to counteract that with facts and knowing that we want to be fair when we're dealing with people. So each one of us has the power to enact individual interventions that can align with our good intentions and our desired outcomes. So how do we do this? First, we want to become conscious, aware of our own biases, which is crucial because we can't solve a problem without knowing what it is. So we have to be willing to take some self inventory, to look at ourselves and to be honest with ourselves. What are some of the biases that we have? What are some of the triggers that exist in our own life to make us feel and to engage and make certain decisions? It starts with ourselves. So after we become much more familiar with our own biases, we can then practice mindfulness and perspective taking. Research has shown us that this is the most effective way of increasing our cognitive control when we are making decisions in our day-to-day life. Mindfulness can improve our personal ability to fully focus on the present. Be aware of what's happening around you now, what you're experiencing in the world today. And this will help us align our associations, of course, with our belief system. Intergroup contact is another effective strategy. It is always important, if you are willing, to move beyond your comfort zone and deal with people that might be in another group, and to be able to understand their worldview and their perspective on what their life experience have been. Finally, exposure to counter stereotypical examples can challenge our implicit biases. When we see people who challenge what our commonly held stereotypes are, that is one of the best tools for us to begin to understand and appreciate people's differences and the value that they bring to us. And we, with our own unique differences, can bring to them. The key takeaway is that we must realize that everyone that you might put in a group based on stereotypes are not the same. Because guess what? People, even in our own in group, are not the same. So we need to pass that consideration over to other people we engage with. We might have great similarities with people in our in group, but we still are independent thinkers. We still have our own point of view. We don't agree on everything. Well, that is the same with people in other groups. There's more that unites us than separates us. And that is the takeaway here. So now we begin to question the stereotypes that we have learned throughout our lives. And we have to understand that, as I said before, groups of people cannot be assumed to be the same because they're not the same even in our own comfort zone in group. So certainly that is the case with other groups of persons. So typically, yes, we tend to see ourselves as good. And we also see those that we have great commonality with as good. So when we're looking at other groups, though, we're not looking at them from that same perspective oftentimes. We're looking at them as a homogeneous group. And that oftentimes is not the case. Counter stereotypical examples can change this thinking by helping our brain to not rely on cognitive shortcuts that stereotypes provide, but let's rely on mindfulness. Let's think through a process and base it on facts, not emotions or triggers that have existed and still exist in our life today. So in conclusion, I hope that this experience has been engaging, enriching, and yes, a bit challenging. How do you begin to take this information and move it into action? By disrupting undesirable biases within ourselves, our institutions, and our communities, we can make a meaningful and positive impact in our society. We will move one step closer to being the individuals we want to be and a part of a society that values us all. Now, I'm going to address some of the most common questions and answers when dealing with the subject matter of implicit and unconscious bias and how it impacts our decision making. How do biases affect us? Answer: bias tendencies can also affect our professional lives as well as personal. They can influence actions and decisions, such as how we interact with persons of a particular group, what advice we consider. And again, bias awareness can help you make fair, professional, and personal decisions. Next question: how do you examine your own biases? The answer: first, introspection. Explore and identify your own prejudices by taking implicit association tests or through other means of self analysis. Key takeaway: we all have them because we all are byproducts of our life experiences. So, this is a tool that can help us address this in each of our lives. Mindfulness: since you're more likely to give in to your biases when you're under pressure, practice ways to reduce stress and increase a more focus and mindfulness in your life. How does bias develop? Answer: bias is acquired at your early age, often as a result of one's upbringing. This unconscious bias becomes problematic when it causes an individual or group to treat others poorly as a result of their gender, ethnicity, race, or other factors. And finally, let's address how to reduce bias. Because now that we have defined it, we have been able to discuss tools for us to be able to identify it in ourselves. Finally, let's look at how we can mitigate bias so that we are treating people in our lives in a fair, just, and equitable way. Focus on seeing people as individuals. Now, I focused a great deal on the point that as we gather data and we collect it and we categorize it, we tend to put people in groups, and those groups are going to be good or bad depending on our biases. But if we tend to deal with people on an individual basis as opposed to the group in our mind we feel they belong to, we will then be much more equitable in our treatment of those persons. And we'll begin to even see that once we appreciate an individual, we'll begin to see that whatever our biases is towards that group might not be consistent at all with what our thought process has been for most of our lives. Work on consciously changing your stereotypes. Work on yourself to be able to be as objective as you can when you're dealing with people and not relying on the biases that you have considered for years that might be based on total inaccuracies. Take the time to pause and to reflect on what you're doing when you're making your decisions to make sure that they're consistent with your belief system and the true outcomes that you want. Adjust your perspective. Increase your exposure. It is very important that if you're willing to move beyond your comfort zone and to engage with people that you might perceive that are in a different group, it might bring such enrichment to your life and great value to yourself and those you engage with. And finally, practice mindfulness. When we are looking to engage with people, we're going to make decisions that will have an impact on other people's lives, both personally and professionally. Rely on the facts, not on emotionalism, not on triggers that can be based on inaccurate decision, because that does not serve you well or the person that you are dealing with from a bias standpoint. I trust and hope that this has been beneficial to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for your time. And I turn this back over to Mary Ann.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. We did have one question. It was so thorough. You covered a lot of questions. We did have one question. You talk about tests that people could do, self-testing. Do you know of any website or one that you might suggest that you take privately on your own?
Yes, I suggest you Google Implicit Bias Association. That is a test that has been used for years that will enable you to take some self-inventory on yourself. And it will be quite enlightening, surprisingly enlightening, because oftentimes we think we have certain points of view, but when we deal with a test such as Implicit Bias Association, it allows us to really, as I say it oftentimes, look at the man in the mirror, because we can certainly be honest with ourselves, right? We don't have to be concerned about, oh, well, if I say this, is it wrong? Am I going to be perceived a certain way? But the reality is we all have biases. And yes, we all have prejudices. And in order to address it, the Implicit Bias Association test helps identify it in ourselves. And then once we do that, we're able to know how to effectively address it when we find ourselves in those situations.
Yeah, that's great, great suggestion. What was the website again?
Implicit Bias Association test.
Implicit Bias Association tests. Okay, everybody's asking. And you're getting some comments here. Thank you so much. Excellent. Can you upload the presentation? You can. LIBOR records these, and Tanya did give us permission to record it. And if you go to lirealtor.com under education, it will say Wednesday webinars, and all of the recorded webinars are there. As a matter of fact, this is the second time that Tanya's offering this for us. So her previous one is there as well. I mean, just to summarize, you take all of this information and you can just think through the negative impact on selling houses and what that can do to future buyers, sellers, and so on. So we thank you, and we know why this is an important topic, and 2 hours of implicit bias will be a required topic for continuing education for every license renewal. So definitely more and more focus on this topic and us being enlightened. So we thank you, Tanya, for being with us today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this opportunity.
Okay, have a good day.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.